The hidden addiction no one talks about. Thinking what? If I told you that you're addicted to thinking, that your compulsive mental activity isn't productivity or intelligence, but a neurological addiction, as real as substance dependency, complete with cravings, withdrawal symptoms, an escalating tolerance that requires ever more mental stimulation to satisfy? Not metaphorical comparison. Actual documented brain chemistry showing thinking activates the same reward pathways as drugs. This isn't mindfulness meditation nonsense. This is hard addiction neuroscience. Researchers studying thought patterns and brain reward systems have discovered something disturbing. Your default mode networked the brain system generating nonstop internal dialogue, planning, and rumination releases dopamine during mental activity. This creates a reinforcement loop where thinking feels productive and necessary, while actually becoming compulsive and depleting. Your brain has learned that thinking equals reward, which means you cannot stop thinking even when thinking serves no purpose. Here's what changes everything. Modern life provides unlimited thought triggers, news, social media, endless options, constant problems to solve, like giving an alcoholic unlimited free alcohol. You're living in an environment that feeds your thinking addiction continuously. Your ancestors thought intermittently when problems required solutions. You think continuously because your brain is now addicted to the neurochemical hit. Ancient contemplative traditions recognize compulsive thinking as the primary source of suffering and called it monkey mind. Modern neuroscience has revealed the exact mechanisms: dopaminergic reinforcement, default mode network hyperactivity, and prefrontal cortex addiction to problem-solving stimulation. I'm about to expose 10 specific protocols for recognizing and breaking your thinking addiction. Your mind is running you. Time to take back control. Body. The 10 Techniquest Part 1. Thought Frequency Baseline Assessment. Protocol: you think occasionally when needed. You don't. You think constantly, an estimated 60,000 to 80,000 thoughts per day, most repetitive, unnecessary, and automatic. You're essentially running mental commentary 16 hours daily without pause. Neuroscientists studying consciousness have discovered that your default mode network activates automatically whenever you're not engaged in focused external tasks. This network generates self-referential thinking, planning, and rumination as its baseline activity. Your brain's resting state is thinking, not silence. You're addicted because you literally cannot turn it off. This is technique number 1 out of 10, the Thought Frequency Baseline Assessment Protocol. Here's your exact practice for 7 days. Set random timers 10 times daily. When each alarm sounds, immediately note whether you were actively thinking. Document the specific thought content: planning, replaying, worrying, fantasizing, problem solving. Calculate your thinking frequency percentage. Most discover they're thinking 90% plus of waking hours. You're gathering evidence of addiction severity. The mechanism creates awareness through data collection. By documenting actual thinking frequency, you're providing your prefrontal cortex with objective evidence that thinking isn't occasional tool use, but continuous compulsive activity. This recognition is essential for treating addiction. You cannot address what you don't acknowledge. You're essentially conducting a thought audit to establish baseline addiction levels. Start tracking your actual thinking frequency and watch your assumption of occasional thinking collapse under evidence of continuous mental activity. Part 2. Dopamine Reinforcement Recognition Method. Every time you think through a problem, your brain releases dopamine even if thinking doesn't actually solve anything. This creates the illusion that thinking is productive when it's often just feeding your addiction. Research on problem solving and reward systems reveals that your ventral tegmental area releases dopamine during cognitive effort, not just outcomes. Your brain rewards the process of thinking independent of results. This means you get neurochemical hits from ruminating uselessly about unsolvable problems. You're essentially getting high on thinking about problems rather than solving them. This is technique number 2 out of 10, the Dopamine Reinforcement Recognition Method. Execute this protocol for 30 days. Maintain a thought productivity log. Each time you catch yourself in extended thinking, right? 1. What was I thinking about? 2. Did this thinking produce actionable insight or solution? 3. Did I take action based on the thinking? Most will discover less than 10% of thinking produces action. You're exposing the gap between thinking reward and thinking utility. Why this works? You're revealing thinking's reinforcement disconnection from outcomes. By documenting how rarely thinking leads to action, You're providing evidence that dopamine rewards you receive weren't earned through productivity. Your prefrontal cortex begins recognizing thinking as addictive behavior rather than productive tool use. You're essentially proving to yourself that thinking addiction masquerades as problem solving. Start logging thinking versus action outcomes and watch your brain's illusion of productive thinking shatter. Part 3. Mental withdrawal symptom identification technique. When you try to stop thinking, you experience withdrawal, restlessness, anxiety, discomfort, and powerful urges to return to mental activity. This isn't meditation difficulty, it's addiction withdrawal. Neuroscientists studying meditation and default mode network suppression have found that reducing thought activity initially increases activity in your anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors for conflicts and generates anxiety. Your brain experiences thought cessation as threat, triggering stress responses to force you back into thinking. You're physiologically dependent on continuous mental activity. This is technique number 3 out of 10. The mental withdrawal symptom identification technique. Your intervention is specific for 21 days. Attempt 5 thought breaks daily, 3-minute periods of intentionally not thinking. Don't meditate or focus on breath. Simply refuse to engage with thoughts. Document the withdrawal symptoms that arise. Restlessness, anxiety, urgency, discomfort, compelling urges to plan, analyze, replay. Rate intensity 1 to 10. This data proves you're experiencing actual withdrawal from thinking. The mechanism exposes addiction through withdrawal evidence. By intentionally ceasing the addictive behavior and documenting the distress response, you're proving dependency exists. Your brain cannot comfortably exist without thinking, which defines addiction. You're essentially running a controlled withdrawal experiment to confirm addiction diagnosis. Start attempting thought breaks and watch withdrawal symptoms prove your thinking dependency is physiological, not psychological preference. Part 4. Tolerance escalation detection system. You need increasingly complex problems to think about to get the same satisfaction. Simple thoughts no longer provide adequate stimulation. This escalating tolerance is classic addiction progression. Research on cognitive stimulation seeking shows that your brain's reward response to familiar thought patterns diminishes through habituation. You require novel, more complex, or more emotionally charged thinking to achieve the same dopamine release. This drives you toward catastrophizing, creating problems, or seeking drama, anything to generate thinking that still feels rewarding. This is technique number 4 out of 10. The tolerance escalation detection system. Here's your practice for 40 days. Track your thinking complexity progression. Know what problems you obsessively think about. Ask, is this problem actually worse than problems I thought about last year? Or have I escalated to bigger, more abstract concerns because previous thinking lost its kick? Document evidence of tolerance. Simple problems no longer capture attention. Only existential or catastrophic thinking feels engaging. Why this works? You're revealing the escalation pattern characteristic of addiction. By comparing current versus past thinking content, you're exposing how your brain requires progressively more intense mental stimulation. This recognition allows your prefrontal cortex to see thinking as addiction, rather than appropriate response to worsening circumstances. You're diagnosing tolerance escalation. Start tracking thinking complexity escalation and watch addiction tolerance patterns become undeniable. Part 5. Trigger stimulus exposure reduction. Protocol. Your environment is full of thinking triggers: news, social media, email, notifications, each designed to start your thinking engine. Like an alcoholic living in a bar, you're surrounded by addiction cues. Neuroscientists studying environmental triggers and habit formation have discovered that your brain develops powerful associations between external cues and behavioral responses. Every notification, headline, or social media post triggers your default mode network to activate and generate thinking. You're being externally prompted to engage your addiction dozens of times daily. This is technique number 5 out of 10. The Trigger Stimulus Exposure Reduction Protocol. Execute this sequence for 60 days. Systematically eliminate thinking triggers. Remove news apps. Disable non-essential notifications. Check email at designated times only. Unfollow accounts that trigger worry or comparison thinking. Create trigger-free zones. Your bedroom, first hour of morning, last hour before sleep, where thinking prompts are completely absent. Document reduction in spontaneous thinking episodes. The mechanism reduces cue-induced relapse. By eliminating environmental triggers, you're preventing automatic activation of thinking patterns. Your default mode network receives fewer external prompts, which reduces overall thinking frequency. You're essentially removing yourself from the environment feeding your addiction. Start systematically eliminating thinking triggers and watch compulsive thinking frequency decrease without willpower through environmental design. Part 6. Substitution behavior implementation method. You cannot simply stop an addiction, you must replace it with alternative behaviors that meet similar needs. Pure thought cessation creates a void your brain rushes to fill with more thinking. Research on addiction recovery shows that successful abstinence requires replacement behaviors that provide similar but healthier neurochemical rewards. Your brain needs dopamine sources that don't come from compulsive thinking. Without substitutes, you experience intense cravings and inevitable relapse into mental activity. This is technique number 6 out of 10. The substitution behavior implementation method. Your protocol is this. For 50 days, when you catch yourself in compulsive thinking, immediately substitute physical sensation focus. Place your attention entirely on your hand's temperature, your breath's texture, sounds in your environment, or physical movement. Spend minimum 90 seconds in pure sensory awareness before returning to necessary thinking. You're giving your brain alternative stimulation that doesn't involve thought. Why this works? Sensory awareness activates your insula and somatosensory cortex, while suppressing your default mode network. You're providing dopamine through present moment sensory engagement rather than thinking. Your brain learns it can feel engaged and stimulated without thinking. You're essentially retraining your reward system to accept non-thinking alternatives. Start substituting sensory awareness for compulsive thinking and watch your brain discover it can feel satisfied without mental activity. Part 7. Craving recognition and delay technique. Experience powerful urges to think about specific topics, that conversation, that problem, that worry. These aren't rational decisions to think. They're cravings. Addiction urges to engage your mental patterns. Neuroscientists studying craving mechanisms have found that your orbitofrontal cortex generates powerful motivation to engage in addictive behaviors when triggered. These cravings feel like urgent needs requiring immediate action, but cravings naturally peak and subside within 10 to 15 minutes if not indulged. You're experiencing thinking urges that will pass if you don't engage. This is technique number 7 out of 10. The craving recognition and delay technique. Here's your intervention for 45 days. Practice urge surfing with thinking cravings. When you feel a powerful urge to think about something, replay that argument. Solve that unsolvable problem. Plan that uncertain future. Name it. This is a thinking craving. Set a timer for 15 minutes and refuse to engage. Notice the urge's intensity rise and fall. Document how often cravings completely dissipate when not indulged. The mechanism teaches craving impermanence. By observing without engaging, you're training your prefrontal cortex to recognize that thinking urges aren't emergencies requiring immediate response. Your orbitofrontal cortex learns that cravings pass naturally. You're essentially developing the capacity to experience thinking urges without automatically acting on them. Start surfing thinking cravings without engagement and watch their power diminish as you prove they're temporary urges, not genuine needs. Part 8. Identity separation development protocol. You believe you are your thoughts. This identification makes thinking cessation feel like self-annihilation, which makes sobriety impossible. Addiction recovery requires separating observer from behavior. Research on metacognition and self-awareness shows that your brain has distinct systems, one that thinks and one that observes thinking. Your anterior prefrontal cortex can watch your default mode network's activity without being identical to it. Most people never develop this observer perspective, which means they experience thoughts as self rather than mental events happening to self. This is technique number 8 out of 10. The Identity Separation Development Protocol. Execute this practice for 70 days. Practice thought labeling. Every time you notice thinking occurring, mentally label it. Thinking about work, planning dinner, replaying conversation. Don't stop the thoughts. Just label them as if you're an external observer documenting mental events. The labeling creates psychological distance between observer you and observed thoughts. You're developing the witness perspective essential for addiction recovery. Why this works. Labeling activates your prefrontal cortex's meta-awareness while creating psychological distance from default mode network activity. You begin experiencing thoughts as events you observe rather than activities you are. This separation is essential. You cannot recover from an addiction you're identified with. You're building the observer capacity that allows thinking cessation without self-annihilation. Start labeling every thought you notice and watch identity shift from I am thinking to thinking is occurring. Part 9. Relapse. Pattern anticipation system. You will have periods of reduced thinking followed by relapse into compulsive mental activity. This isn't failure. It's the standard addiction recovery pattern. Anticipating and planning for relapse reduces its impact. Neuroscientists studying addiction relapse have identified high-risk situation stress, boredom, emotional intensity, decision fatigue where relapse probability spikes. Your thinking addiction follows identical patterns. Without relapse anticipation, each episode feels like complete failure. With anticipation, relapse becomes expected data requiring adjustment rather than evidence of hopelessness. This is technique number 9 out of 10. The relapse pattern anticipation system. Your intervention is systematic. Identify your 3 highest risk relapse situations times. When thinking addiction resurges. Common examples: nighttime, after difficult days, during uncertainty, when alone. For 55 days, create specific protocols for each situation when trigger occurs. I will specific alternative behavior. Document relapses without judgment, their data revealing what protocols need adjustment. You're treating relapse as expected and informative rather than catastrophic. The mechanism normalizes recovery challenges. By anticipating relapse and preparing responses, you're preventing the shame spiral that perpetuates addiction. Your prefrontal cortex receives permission to view thinking resumption as temporary setback, requiring adjustment rather than personal failure. You're building resilience through realistic expectations. Start anticipating and planning for relapse situations and watch recovery become iterative process rather than pass, fail, test. Part 10. Purpose. Restoration integration method. You use thinking to avoid feeling present moment discomfort and authentic connection. Your addiction serves the function of numbing and distraction. Recovery requires addressing what thinking helps you avoid. Research on addiction functionality reveals that addictive behaviors persist because they serve psychological purposes: emotional regulation, stress management, boredom avoidance. Your thinking addiction helps you escape present moment reality into mental simulation, where you feel more control. Without addressing this function, you'll relapse continuously because thinking genuinely serves you. This is technique number 10 out of 10. The Purpose Restoration Integration Method. Here's your practice for 90 days. Each time you catch compulsive thinking, ask, what am I avoiding right now by thinking instead of being present? Document patterns: avoiding discomfort, escaping boredom, numbing emotion, preventing intimacy. Then deliberately face what you're avoiding for 60 seconds before returning the necessary activity. You're identifying and addressing thinking's avoidance function. Why this works: you're exposing what thinking protects you from. By deliberately experiencing what you habitually avoid through thinking, you're reducing the need for thinking as escape. Your brain begins tolerating present moment reality without requiring mental distraction. You're essentially treating the underlying pain that thinking medicates. Start identifying what thinking helps you avoid and watch addiction necessity decrease as you develop capacity to be present with discomfort. Closing these 10 protocols aren't productivity tips, they're addiction recovery methods for recognizing and treating your thinking dependency. Frequency assessment, dopamine recognition, withdrawal identification, tolerance detection, trigger elimination, behavior substitution, craving management, identity separation, relapse planning, purpose restoration. Together, they form a comprehensive system for treating compulsive thinking as the neurological addiction it actually is. Ancient contemplative traditions recognized incessant thinking as the primary obstacle to peace and called it the tyranny of mind. Modern neuroscience has revealed the exact mechanisms: dopaminergic reinforcement, default mode network hyperactivity, and reward system hijacking that creates genuine psychological dependency. Science has proven what meditators always knew: you are not your thoughts, and the voice in your head isn't wisdom or intelligence. It's often just addiction-driven mental activity masquerading as productivity. Your thinking serves you sometimes. More often, you serve it. Your transformation doesn't start tomorrow or next week. It starts the moment you recognize your first thinking craving. Label your first thought as observed event rather than self, or deliberately face what thinking